My name is Mircea Munteanu. I am the project associate at the Woodrow Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program and the Cold War International History Project. And I want to welcome all of you here today. For those of you who are not familiar with the Wilson Center and the project, let me just say a few words. The Wilson Center is the nation's official living memorial to President Woodrow Wilson. It is a nonpartisan institute for advanced study and a neutral forum for open, serious, and informed dialogue. It brings preeminent thinkers to Washington for extended periods of time to interact with policymakers through a large number of programs and projects. The Center seeks to separate the important from the inconsequential and take a historical and broad perspective on the issues. At the Wilson Center, the Cold War International History Program, part of the Center's History and Public Policy program, supports the full and prompt release of historical materials by governments on all sides of the Cold War and seeks to accelerate the process of integrating new sources, materials, and perspectives from the former communist bloc with a historiography of the Cold War. It also seeks to transcend barriers of language, geography, and regional specialty to create new links among scholars interested in Cold War history. Among the activities undertaken by the project to promote this aim are the periodic bulletin, copies of which are available outside, and other publications to disseminate new findings, views, and activities pertaining to Cold War history. The project's virtual archive, the largest collection of declassified communist archival documents available online in translation, and international scholarly meetings, conferences, and seminars. I will point out that we very recently just published a e-dossier, part of our e-dossier series, on the CSCE process and East German understanding of the CSCE process. It is available on the Center's website at cwihp.org, the author of which are here in this room, Oliver Bange, will be speaking today on his new book, and Stefan Kienigan was a young German historian and whose connection to the Center includes a stint at the Cold War Project as a research assistant. Today's seminar, as I said, features a longtime partner and friend of the project, Dr. Oliver Bange. Dr. Bange is the editor of the volume at the center of today's talk, Helsinki 1975 and the Transformation of Europe, again, copies of which are available for purchase outside. He is also a senior researcher and lecturer at the University of Mannheim in Germany. He holds a PhD in international history from the London School of Economics and coordinates the project CSCE and the Transformation of Europe at the University of Mannheim. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Also participating on the panel today is Ambassador Arthur Hartman, a career State Department official who served as Assistant Secretary of State for European and Canadian Affairs during the Nixon and Ford Administrations. Subsequently, Ambassador Hartman served as U.S. Ambassador to France as well as the Soviet Union. The format of today's talk will be that Dr. Bange will be speaking for roughly 35-40 minutes, followed by some comments on the book and his experiences by Ambassador Hartman, after which we'll open it up to question and answers from the audience. I'll ask you to please wait for the microphone and identify yourself. We are live on the World Wide Web as we speak, so please bear with us. Thank you. Bange?
All right. Do I have to push a button here?
Yeah. It's okay.
Right. I'm glad that you could make it to this book launch. And, well, I think there's no better way to open a discussion on the contents than actually to take the book as your very starting point of the presentation. If you look at the book, it's blue, okay. There's a lot of text in the background with some yellow passages, and it says Helsinki 1975 and the Transformation of Europe. Now, Helsinki 1975 is, of course, especially the US acronym for the Final Act with which in August 1975 the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe ended in Helsinki. Transformation describes a process of change rather than the moment of change, the sudden change or revolution. So transformation, we are talking about a long drawn-out process. Now, the long text in the background with the little orange or yellow highlights is actually taken from the Helsinki Final Act. And the two highlights are also focusing on the themes of the book, that is, free movement of persons and ideas, and the peaceful change of frontiers in particularly. In my experience, this book is a rare case of an edited volume with a central argument. Running all through. If you add to the two themes which I've just mentioned a third problem, namely the problem of the divided Germany in the middle of Europe, which of course interreacts with both the free movement and the peaceful change of frontiers, then you have the central theme of the book. And to the argument. The argument of the book is that in the West, CSCE was thought up and eventually served as a framework, an international political framework for stable change. Let me just run down that Western idea, that Western transformation rationale. The rationale was that granting external stability and recognition to the communist leaders in Eastern Europe, this would allow them, A, for multiplication of contacts and a multiplication of communication. It was assumed that this would in time create desires and pressures for reforms well beyond the vocal and visual dissident groups within these communist societies. C, the external stability granted would allow regimes to respond to these pressures, thereby slowly and inadvertently and irreversibly sliding towards the eve of communist rule. And D, at which point, thought to be half a century ahead, the issue of Germany's reunification could also be addressed once again. In short, to cite one of Egon Bahr's famous and often misinterpreted dictums, to acknowledge the status quo in order to overcome it. Now to questions. From these ideas in the West on how best to induce change in Eastern Europe derive a whole number of really central questions. Obviously, from what I have just outlined, this transformation rationale, behind French détente, German Ostpolitik, American bridge building, was an offensive rather than a defensive concept. In short, one had to believe in the possibility of change in communist societies, otherwise it didn't make sense. So one is immediately pointed to the question of how this opening up concept could coexist and eventually even outlive the defensive, status quo-focused approaches in Nixon's White House and Brezhnev's Kremlin. One also has to ask, who were the people and who carried and pursued these ideas in the West? And one has to look at their networks and how that relatively small international community of transformation strategists outmaneuvered the Cold Warriors within their own respective administrations. The interrelationship between the so-called soft contents of the CSCE negotiations, culture, human contacts, even economics, and the disarmament negotiations on nuclear weapons and troop cuts, then underway between the two superpowers, is another crucial field to be explored. Which role did economics play? What was the balance between supporting communist regimes through trade and opening them up to Western thought and competition? And another absolutely crucial question, did the countries of the Warsaw Pact realize the long-term explosives embedded in this soft strategy of the West? And how did they react to this, both as a group and separately? What were their reasons and assumed gains to eventually engage in this so-called CSCE process? Well, I'm not going to answer these questions right now. But I will come back to them, and in the meantime, you just have to sit through some remarks on methodology. All contributions to the book work and analyze on three levels. First, the level of East-West communication. Second, the level of mutual perceptions and perceptions of oneself. And third, the level of bilateral relations within the international system. As the essays clearly show, in reality, that is, in this history, these levels remained inseparable, presenting a net of mutual influences. And it is thereby that the specific national findings are essentially interlinked and contribute to the book's central themes and argument. The book, like a parallel publication now edited by Andreas Wenger and Wojtek Mastny, takes a first historiographical that is source-based look at the origins of the CSCE process. This means that the book deals with the time up to the Helsinki Final Act in August 1975, which meant the creation of the multilateral policy framework within which the CSCE process involving Charter 77, Solidarność, Soviet Helsinki groups, Western Helsinki watch committees could then take place. Nevertheless, several of the contributions, particularly those by Wanda Jarząbek and Svetlana Savranskaya, provide an outlook on the eventual dynamic and the effects triggered off by the Helsinki framework. That leads me on to another point, the GDR. The effects were such that at the end of this process, one of the participating state actors, Eastern Germany, would even lose its livelihood. In the light of this, some of you might wonder why there is no chapter on the GDR in the book. The answer is that 2 years ago, when we tried to put the book together, we had no text of suitable quality that we might have wished to include. In the meantime, we have tried to make up for this by compiling an e-dossier in cooperation with the Wilson Center's International Cold War History Project, which has been put online only yesterday. It includes an introductory text, a whole number of documents from the GDR's foreign ministry, and a comment by Siegfried Bock, the East German head of delegation. It clearly documents how and when the GDR's offensive Cold War stance was eventually reversed under Soviet pressure as late as 1969-1970. The key question, which both Siegfried Bock as a leading former GDR official and I as a relatively junior West German historian, the same question we do approach, and I provocatively called it negotiating one's own demise. Now it seems that, and this leads me back to the questionnaire, it seems that three perceptions, or assumptions if you like, were central to Eastern European communist leaders' approval of the CSCE process, as outlined in the Catalogue of Principles and the Basket 3 of the Helsinki Final Act. The Helsinki product was widely perceived as a deal between Western and especially West German informal acknowledgement of the post-war borders and thereby implicitly of the Soviet Empire, combined with improved conditions for the exchange of technology and trade, in return for language on human rights and human contacts, uncommitting under the rules of international law. Remember, the Helsinki Final Act was not a treaty. All right, where do we go from here? And it is here that, as is also borne out by Csaba Béké's contribution on the Warsaw Pact, the already mentioned assumptions come in, the three assumptions. The first of these, as Brezhnev and Henry Kissinger do not stop assuring each other in these years, is that CSCE is only a box of words to calm each other's European allies. And that the real power, and therefore, laid with nuclear warheads and with the number of tanks and soldiers that one had, and that therefore the real negotiations took place elsewhere between Washington and Moscow. Secondly, as Brezhnev and Erich Honecker, the East German leader who succeeded Walter Ulbricht, agreed shortly before the signing of the Helsinki Accords, one was banking on the, quote, power of the factual. Western recognition of borders and rulers would help to socialize an entire new generation within their communist state and system, simply because this recognition seemed to rule out national or societal options. And finally, as Honecker put it to Brezhnev half-jokingly, quote, there will always be the Stasi, so there will always be the secret police. In other words, Eastern leaders remain convinced, despite severe warnings from their experts, that they could deal effectively with dissent and reform movements within their own societies. This dichotomy between a clear understanding of the aims of the Western transformation policies and the belief in one's own domestic strengths is particularly present in the contribution by Ionescu, Baev and Gorchev on Romania and Bulgaria. While on the other hand, the ongoing, continuing dualism between Western strategies for a status quo or for transformation in Europe is omnipresent in the contributions on the FRG, Western Germany, France, Britain, and the USA, by Mary Pierret, Luca Ratti, and the editors. And it seems, following the new research by Stefan Kieninger, that this conceptual conflict, far transcending bureaucratic rivalries also present at the time, was nowhere more apparent than here in Washington. With key US personnel playing ball with their West European colleagues in order to push the Nixon-Kissinger White House towards accepting the Helsinki script, and thereby unintentionally also endorsing the transformation rationale behind it. And I'm glad that Ambassador Arthur Hartman is with us today, the very man who functioned as the intermediary between the State Department and the White House on CSCE-related matters, and, as Henry Kissinger claimed in his memoirs, the only man who had been able to explain CSCE to him. Let me finish with some wider contextualization of our subject. All contributions in this volume point to the same set of questions, apparently essential for our understanding of the processes at work throughout the 1970s and 1980s. These questions include the origins and nature of the process of transformation in Europe, national perceptions and their changes, and the ultimately peaceful solution of the German question and the border issues involved. If there is one general conclusion from the findings of this volume, then it must be that further multi-archival and multi- and transnational research is urgently needed. From this, then, one might expect valid explanations for the process leading to an integrated Europe with all its optimistic hopes and unavoidable stagnation in an era which saw the most momentous change in European post-war history, and which has to be perceived as the starting point of the development leading up to 1989-90. Inasmuch the CSCE historiography of our book points to 1989-90 not so much as a short or medium-term combination of Reaganite armament policies and dissident heroes, which certainly played a part, but explains it as a rather longish, drawn-out process. A process that created doubts and then the will for reform in the mind of at least some Eastern European leaders, and of course, far and foremost, Mikhail Gorbachev. And because we are looking at a continuing and irreversible process of East-West cooperation and communication, which began in the era of détente of the late 1960s and did not cease after 1975, the conceptual use of the term Cold War for the entire period between 1945 and 1990 or equally the terminology of the Second Cold War for the period between the late 1970s and the mid-1980s, in that context is somewhat misleading because it neglects the important structural changes in the 1970s to both contents and style of East-West relations, with their momentous impact on the end of the East-West conflict. Yeah, I'm done.
That was short.
Thank you. Actually, I've absented myself from another meeting. The former ambassadors, American ambassadors to Russia or the Soviet Union, and Russian ambassadors to the United States are meeting here in Washington these last 2 days. And much of our discussion goes to process, although we did not discuss particularly this process. We discussed, for example, why, when the Soviet Union began to disintegrate, more thought was not given to the question of how the security situation had so changed that perhaps the structures ought to be re-examined, meaning, of course, NATO and what NATO's function is. And all one has to do is sort of read today's press about the situation in Georgia to see that this question is constantly in the forefront of people's minds when they discuss change, peaceful change, or some leaders may have in mind something less peaceful. But I think the significant fact of the Helsinki process was that it was assumed that whatever change took place was going to have to be peaceful. I still have all the scars, and one of my colleagues can be witness to this, of Henry Kissinger beating me up every time I went into his office on the subject of Basket 3 and what its importance was and why I was causing all this trouble, so that when he went to talk to Mr. Gromyko at that time, Gromyko was constantly needling him about why we were putting such emphasis on this. Well, I don't think Kissinger ever accepted some of my rationale, but certainly those of my colleagues who pushed this very hard with me felt that one of the more subversive things we could do in terms of getting people to think again about the system that had been first imposed on the Russian people and then later on the people of Eastern Europe was to get them talking about some of these issues that were in so-called Basket 3. And in fact, I won't say that that was the principal thing that got people to rethinking their positions, but it certainly undermined this idea that the security forces could control the situation once it got started. Because quite clearly, even in Russia, that was not the case. Although some of us are wondering whether they're going to try it again, it still was quite evident that Gorbachev, particularly, had started a process building on what was going on in the whole Helsinki period of negotiations, whereby he was going to extend to his society this element of openness, this element of getting the people involved in discussing how they were organized, what their complaints were, and listening. After all, Gorbachev was the one who asked Sakharov to come back to Moscow, and where he promptly led the group that wanted to discuss a greater democratization of society, a pluralism in society. And a lot of that, of course, has been lost in recent years, but I have high hopes that it's going to come back again. But the point about the Helsinki process, I think, was, first of all, there was great skepticism in Washington. Kissinger realized, well, first of all, he distrusted Egon Bahr. He thought Egon Bahr, in fact, might be a fellow who was in the pay of the Soviets to pull the wool over our eyes and convince us that somehow or other this evolutionary change was going to be possible, and all we had to do was recognize Russia's position, the Soviet Union's position in Eastern Europe. And the whole debate between the right wing in America and the people around President Ford hinged on that subject. You know, have you given away the store by allowing the Russians to claim that they now have fixed for all time these borders? Well, it wasn't very long after that that a kiss was bestowed on the leader of the GDR, which meant a kiss off in American terms, that Russia was not going to stand in the way of German reunification. And in fact, there was a counterpart to that, which is only now being discussed a bit as we talk about Georgia. What assurances were given to the leadership in the Soviet Union first and then Russia later about the reunification of Germany and Russian acquiescence in a united Germany's joining NATO? What sort of assurances were given by James Baker, for example, that NATO forces would never be moved to the border of Russia? These are in the documentation, and I trust that future researchers will find them somewhere. But I know from people who were present that that was the kind of assurance that was given. And whether it was persuasive to the Russians, probably they didn't quite believe it themselves. But it's clear that a bargain was struck, and that the whole Helsinki process had played a role in this bargain. Russian leadership realized that Germany had, that the FRG had played a key role in bringing along Western opinion and Western governments to accept a loosening, the so-called détente effects, a loosening of the Russian control on Eastern Europe, and in return for that, an incorporation more and more of these countries on the basis of free choice and whether or not borders would be changed. The borders were not important in that respect, except with respect to Poland. And so the whole idea of the Helsinki process was to bring an end to this whole period of division in Europe through peaceful means. And it seems to me that process was a great success. We unfortunately didn't apply the same creativity to a process with the end of the Soviet Union in thinking through what that meant in terms of potential future conflicts in Europe, ethnic difficulties in practically every one of these countries, and did we need another process to discuss how those would be handled in the future? One of the advantages of being semi-retired is that I have a chance of reading a lot more than I did in my previous functions. And one of the things I've been looking at is the whole question of the development of nationality and its effect on ethnic groups from the 19th century on through Woodrow Wilson's what is it, 15 points? How many points did he have?
14.
14, sorry. And the question of what was the basis for self-determination? What was the basis for people within a nation state who felt oppressed, who felt that their cultures were not being recognized, who felt indeed that they were being oppressed in real terms, in physical terms? How could one take account of that within the nation-state system? And it's quite clear we didn't do enough thinking about that in the post-Soviet era in Europe. Whether we can now recapture some of that, and we're already setting the precedents. We've had a vote in Kosovo, which they, in effect, withdrew from a nation-state. They actually used the Helsinki agreements as their one of their justifications, but we never got to the Security Council, so the whole UN system was not there to recognize that such a change could take place peacefully, and the Russians are now using the Kosovo the Kosovo precedent for some of the things that they've been saying. And I encourage you all to read Mr. Medvedev's latest statement on the question of what is the Lebensraum for the new Russia around its borders, to see that this is not going to be a problem that goes away. This is a problem that is with us. One last comment on this. We were talking about, well, you know, is this just something in Eastern Europe and close to the Soviet borders? And I said, well, you know, in 50 or 60 years, who can say what Southern California is going to want to vote in favor of when the overwhelming majority of those people are Hispanic? And then one of the Russians popped up and said, yes, and what about Alaska?
All right, well, thank you, Ambassador Hartman, for your comments. We're going to open it up to Q&A right now. So if Svetlana in there.
First of all,
just 1 second, let me, let's get a mic to you for a second. Thanks.
Svetlana Savranska, the National Security Archive. I was at that early meeting that you mentioned with the ambassadors, and what Mr. Hartman said there about failure or missed opportunity to think in the late 80s, early 90s about alternative security structures in Europe. I left that meeting and I kept thinking about it since, and I just think this is such a precise observation that I think is costing all of us a lot now, that failure of creating creative thinking. But I would like to kind of draw a parallel with the CSCE process, with the Helsinki process. In the mid-70s, as you just mentioned, there was this effort to end the division of Europe. And the Soviet Union was very interested. Of course, Brezhnev put all his reputation behind this idea of reaching this international agreement then would integrate the Soviet Union as an equal to all the great powers. But that desire to integrate, or that willingness to integrate, was not complete, was not comprehensive, because the Soviet Union was not willing to truly implement Basket 3. So it was only integration and security area and the economic area, and it was still very good and creative. And then what happens in the 80s, where the Soviet Union obviously is not just willing, but seems like Gorbachev is truly committed, dying to integrate in the security sphere, in the economic sphere, and fundamentally also in the sphere of human rights, because the internal documents show they were willing to do any concessions on human rights, beginning with Sakharov, but then one after another, political prisoners, freedom of information, all that. And yet the West was not willing to really meet the Soviet Union halfway, or not take Gorbachev's idea of the common European home. It's not so much willing, but I think in 89 and 90 there is this vacuum, this lack of imagination to respond to that idea. And then by 92, 93, it's too late, and then NATO is expanding. What do you think about this? I'm sorry for a very long question.
Or a German comment on that.
Well, I think the question was probably directed to you, but I have a small comment on it as well. Well, you said a vacuum of creativity, a vacuum of ideas. And if I combine that with what Ambassador Hartman has just said, we would have to add of creativity and ideas about peaceful change, of peaceful transformation, of envisaging a common future, or a common European house, or whatever house you might call that today. I entirely agree. But I think part of that problem, what we have today, and part of the problem is that vacuum in the early 1990s, which I believe came about because of 1989-90. It all happened so suddenly, and it was a revolution, and we Westerners anyway, we were all taken aback by the whole speed of it. But if you look at it, and that's the argument of the book, it's a long process. It's a process of change and a process of delivering the framework in which that change can take place. And I think in 1990-92, maybe even right up into the mid-1990s, many people in the West or around the globe expected Russia and the post-Soviet republics to just follow. Give them another 5 years or another 10 years, and they will go the same way as Czechoslovakia, Poland, and now the new EU members, Bulgaria and Romania, and prospectively even Serbia, have gone or will go. And I think concerning Russia, that idea that Russia would just follow swiftly and they would develop from itself democratic institutions, rule of law, etc., that is based on a number of false assumptions, because the conditions in Russia were and are different than those in East Germany or in Prague or in Warsaw. And that is namely that you have a far longer tradition of authoritarian rule, which has to be overcome and which has to be changed, and it has to be changed in the mind of the people. And if you look at Medvedev or Putin, what they are doing today, they are a lot of that. What the West or the global public fears is actually a foreign policy rhetoric directed at the domestic crowd. That is at least my opinion. So in a way, what I'm driving at is that I believe that it would be positive and beneficial for both sides to start a new process of transformation, with the expectation and the prospect that it won't happen overnight, that it won't happen in 5 years, but that it give it another 50 years or so, and then we see what's going to happen. Yeah? But I don't think it won't take place overnight. I can't imagine that.
Well, Europe transformed overnight.
No, but you're right. What hasn't transformed overnight is a couple of 100 years of history on the Russian side, where they have had autocratic systems, and they feel themselves more secure in such an autocratic system. And this takes the form of stopping debate, stopping openness in public discussion. And I think we have always felt that unless there was an openness in public discussion and a sort of pluralism that was growing from the roots of society, that these changes could not be kept permanent. that sooner or later an authoritarian system would reassert itself, and in order to hold things together, to prevent the ethnic groups from splintering. And I was struck today, talking to some of my colleagues. I've recently read Tim Colton's book on Yeltsin. When I raised some of the points Tim made in the Yeltsin book with my Russian colleagues, uniformly anti-Yeltsin. I mean, they thought Yeltsin was the worst thing that ever happened to Russia. And yet, he was part of a continuum from Gorbachev. And what he did in the short period of time that he was in power, or at least the people around him were able to accomplish, was to keep that opening of society, to keep the press more or less free, to television, all the things that would gradually integrate that society with the outside world were continually kept open. Mm-hmm. And that began to shut down in the post-Yeltsin period for a lot of reasons. But what struck me is here my colleagues, who I consider to be, fairly liberal and modern, are so anti-Yeltsin. I mean, it struck me that their sort of support for Putin and Medvedev and the system that has gradually grown up around them, which does not permit real public discussion. And without real public discussion and openness and the ability of scholars to say what they think, to have this kind of research, I mean, the people who carrying on this sort of research, the archives, first of all, have begun to close. In the immediate Soviet period, they were more or less open. There were a lot of good stuff coming out of them, which helped public understanding. But today, what are you getting? You're getting Stalinism taught in the schools. If you look at today's textbooks in Russia, the closing has begun. It was all beginning to open up. People were talking about real history. That, unfortunately, is not being allowed to continue. And therefore, a Helsinki process, which to my mind depends on that sort of openness. And there, people made jokes about Gorbachev and Glasnost. It was an essential part. I don't even think he recognized what it was going to actually do to society. There were people like Yakovlev around him who did know what it was going to do and pushed it. And even Yakovlev was kind of a latecomer to that kind of view. But unless you can get people talking about their history, talking about current policy, the process stops.
I just want to say that, just following up on Ambassador Hartman's comments, if you're interested in seeing the inside of Gorbachev's inner circle, the National Security Archive has the diary of Anatoly Chernyayev on their website, and it's a fascinating look inside the decision-making process in the Kremlin in 86, 87, right? And 88. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Right here, please.
Hi, my name is Yale Richmond. Arthur Hartman may remember me when I worked on Soviet exchanges at the State Department under his supervision. Given
An essential part of any kind of continuation of the process is open exchanges.
Thank you. Given the history of authoritarian rule that Arthur Hartman referred to, and although the Helsinki Final Act was not a treaty, it was a political statement, how do you explain why the Soviet leaders signed this agreement with Basket 3? Did they really understand what Pandora's box they were opening.
Well, Gorbachev, Gromyko never did, that's for sure. I mean, he joked about it and resisted it because his security people were telling him this is terrible. There are principles in here that undermine what we try to do every day. But the leadership bought this on the basis that it was a recognition, and it was sold to Brezhnev as a recognition of the Soviet and Russian position in Eastern Europe, that would no longer, it could be questioned, there could be peaceful transitions, but they had an absolute solid hold, and they would no longer have to really discuss it very much. And of course, the right wing in America didn't want to hear that either, and they attacked Kissinger and Ford on that very basis, that they'd given away the store. And when, you know, Henry said, well, you're going to send troops in to change these borders, they'd of course said no. And, you know, the days of the Dulles rollback were long since past. But that didn't prevent it from becoming a kind of strange debate, which, to my mind at least, discredited many years after the fact. If you talk to Russians today, they will say that was the beginning of the slippery slope. Things are getting out of our control. We can no longer hold this country and these people together. You know, the old Russian feeling of weakness begins to come out. And so what do? The first thing they tighten up on is everything that's in basket 3.
But
Can I get?
Yeah.
Well, I try to make these 3 points in my presentation, and in a way, I think that spin comes here as well. The fundamental question here is that of perception of the future. How do I see the future development? The East European communist leaders were well informed about Western transformation strategies. Especially the Stasi espionage department had perfect intelligence on what was discussed in the NATO and the European Community Councils, which was basically a discussion and a coordination on how can we get our essential points into basket 3 and how does that work in 10, 15, 20, 30, 50 years' time. That is exactly behind it. They were extremely well informed and they prepared for that. It shows also in their preparations. August 1975 doesn't surprise them. They might have been surprised how quickly the dissidents, especially in the Soviet Union, reacted to it. But that they reacted was no surprise to them, and they had well prepared in about 2 years in advance, more or less, in all the Warsaw Pact countries, how that new situation could be dealt with. Yeah? So how to comply on the surface with the basket 3 provision, how to reduce political prisoners, but how to take those out of action which were of key importance, for example. So you had much more invisible secret police pressures than you had before. Still, at the same time, I think they became even more effective. In the GDR, for example, between 1972 and the late 1970s, the numbers of Stasi full-time employees rocketed to, I think it increased by 60-70%. Clearly combined with the CSCE process and the multilateralization of détente. So you can see that they were well informed, and the key question is, why did they still sign the Helsinki Final Act? And as I said, I think it's a perception of the future. If you play it long term, the perception was, well, the borders are safe, so the GDR is safe, though the GDR is an entity, so at least the East Germans who are growing up in the GDR will take that as their homeland, as their societal framework. They will start to build their future in this society rather than always looking to Western Germany and a possible gap in the wall to get over. And the same, I think, is true for most of the other Warsaw Pact countries. And in a way, the key negotiators in the West and the East looked each other in the eye, knowing what the other one wanted, and thinking that one's own ideas would succeed.
I actually also think that, and Dr. Bange alluded to it during his presentation, is that they actually were secure enough that their secret police could keep a lid on it and move it away from, and there, at least in the Romanian case, there is a reorganization of the secret police in such a way to remove some of the political offenses and move them into the civil offenses category. So, and at the same time, you no longer have arrests, you have harassment, which doesn't show up in the paperwork as an arrest and as political dissidents. You simply have interviews with dissidents or extended conversations with dissidents in which the secret police sort of informs them of the wrong of what they're doing. There are a number of instances in which the reorganization of the secret police in Eastern Europe is meant to deal specifically with the changes under CSCE. All the way in the back over there, and then
thanks. My name is Georgi Khelashvili. I'm short-term scholar at the Cannon Center, and I'm also writing my doctoral dissertation on U.S. foreign policy to Georgia at the University of Oxford. And as for a Georgian citizen, this discussion is probably directly sort of important to me. I think superficially, if we look at the situation, then it's quite similar to the one 30 years ago. You have resurgent Russia, United States that is bogged down in two wars, and my question is, well, Dr. Kissinger's comments about reaching understanding with Russia recently also were based on this, probably. And my question is whether it is possible to replicate the Helsinki process vis-à-vis Russia regionally in the post-Soviet space, because the 5 principles that Dmitry Medvedev advanced a few weeks ago were actually based on the same assumptions of territorial dominance, the sphere of influence, as it was in the 1970s. But at the same time, you face quite different Russia, deeper than the superficial semblance, which is different leaders in the Kremlin, people firmly united behind Putin, and also what the West has to offer to Russians. And when I think about Helsinki process, I always think that feel that maybe there is this wrong feeling that retrospectively too much credit is given to the teleological thinking about its effects. So, in other words, is it worth experimenting again historically? Are we sure that even if Russians agreed to Helsinki process 2, we would get the same results in, say, 15 years' time? Thank you.
I leave that to you.
Well, I think it was Karl Marx who said that if history replicates itself, it becomes a joke. And I think your question, if you can replicate the Helsinki process with all that it included in order to solve the situation in Georgia, would be a false starter. You have to look at what kind of national interests are involved, and I think they have changed, as you yourself have just put it, at least in certain respects, and the framework has changed, obviously, you know, and you have to take account of that. And the question is, the key question, the multi-million-dollar question is, how do we define mutual interests? Interests that will then serve to get a dialogue and a really constructive dialogue going that will eventually lead to a situation, to a framework where these problems that are bedeviling Georgia and Russia can be solved to the advantage of both sides.
Dan Wolfensberger.
I'm Don Wolfensberger with the Congress Project here at the Wilson Center. Enjoyed your presentations, both of them, very much. Dr. Bange, something that you just mentioned before this last point, and Mircea picked up on too, was the point that Honecker used with Brezhnev in '75 when he said, well, even if CSCE leads to greater interaction, communication between the two Germanys, you don't have to worry, you've got the Stasi, and that's when things did intensify more in the way of domestic surveillance and so on. But in your paper, I was a little confused at the end where you said that this increased the negative image, of the Stasi by the German people, but then at the very end of your paper you say that they still opposed the communist reforms. I'm just trying to reconcile those, not being that familiar with the history, as to why they opposed the reforms of the leftist opposition groups. This is in the last sentence of the paper. Perhaps I misread it somehow, but
no, it's in the last page of the e-dossier, right?
Yeah.
Well, the dissidents in Eastern Germany are structurally quite different from the dissidents in most other Eastern European countries. The situation is, of course, quite different. If you're a Romanian and you leave your country, you have to go abroad. And there are, you will live in a different culture, you will live in a different environment. And if you leave in the middle of the Cold War or even in the 1970s and 80s, the likelihood at the point of time is that you lose your home, your language, your culture, your friends, forever. Now in Germany, of course, there's always the option, it's a hard option, but it is an option to just go over to the other country, the other German
And become chancellor.
State. Chancelloress. Yes, to go to the other country, to the other state on German soil, which is close by, and you might even have possibilities to see your relatives and your neighbors according to the inner Germ, as they were called, the inner Germ relations and the inner Germ agreements. So compared to what other Eastern Europeans had to cope with when they left their own country, that was a rather soft option. It wasn't a soft option, but in that comparison, it was certainly easier. And that, of course, led to a drain of prospective opposition personnel. So a lot of the people who disagreed with the GDR took the option of actually leaving their country, certainly after being harassed for years and decades. Much more people from these prospective opposition groups left the GDR than, I would say, any other Eastern European country. So that is just one background. There are a few other reasons for it as well, that many of the dissidents in the late 1980s were actually of some Marxist conviction themselves. There could be Trotskyists, Marxists, even communists. If you look at the group around Hartman, they would define themselves as communists. But communists which wanted a more open society and claimed even a return to Marx's idea themselves. Now comes up 1988, 1989, 1990. You have all these dissident movements around Eastern Europe, successfully pressing for reforms in their own countries, and of course the pressure for reform in the GDR rises. It's rising quickly, and these dissidents finally feel that it is their chance to get their ideas, to realize their ideas. And you have to remember that that leftist dissident movement in the GDR had very few contacts to other Eastern European dissident movements, because especially the Poles, Solidarność, or the Helsinki groups in Moscow, they were quite suspicious of them. For them, they had still that smell of Marxism, communism, being tempted to coordinate with the authorities, etc., etc. So within the GDR, the situation is quite different from the other European countries. And when it comes to it, when it comes to the first free general elections in the GDR, these old leftist dissidents in the GDR have high hopes. They have high hopes because they have been the only, for a long time, they had been the only visible opposition in the GDR, and they thought, well, this is now time for change. And not for complete revolution. We will reform the communist rule in this country, and suddenly you have all kinds of impossible coalitions. Suddenly you have these people of these leftist dissident groups discussing with Markus Wolf, the former head of the GDR espionage service, discussing constitutional reform, for example, in November, December 1989. Impossible to imagine even 10 or maybe even 2 or 3 years before. But of course, their reform agenda for the GDR, and it was a reform agenda for the GDR, not for Germany. They wanted to keep the GDR as a leftist model in Germany, was entirely rejected by the GDR population for that very same reason. Does that?
Thank you.
All right, just a couple of more questions right here.
Bill Hill, currently with the National War College, but I began my CSCE involvement with the Wiener Treffen, a number of other follow-up and specialized meetings. I was CSCE coordinator here in the early 90s, and then several field missions. What I hear about the process is it really brings back a lot of memories and strikes me as really a very good representation of what happened. I'd like to make an observation and get your reaction to it. Well, two of them. First, the first 15-year process did not go smoothly. There was a small matter of martial law in Poland that interrupted the Madrid follow-up meeting for a couple of years. So this did not go necessarily in a straight line, and still operates. But one of the things, your question of why did the Eastern leaders agree to this, it certainly was the impression once you have the Final Act, the Decalogue in Basket 1 principles, and the complex, there were still things that the East wanted, in particular elements of military and hard security that required an ongoing dialogue with Western states and the Western participants. And what they met there was the so-called comprehensive idea of security, that security was not whole and was not attainable without the other elements of the so-called human dimension, the fundamental freedoms, the human contacts, and this side of the internal organization of states. And therefore, I'm not sure that they realized at the time, but they were caught in a process because the process still offered them things that were valuable to them but were not achievable without continuing to engage in this dialogue that gave the other Western participating states a handle and a window and avenue into their societies, a handle which was basically terribly subversive and disruptive in the end.
No, I agree. I mean, that was the basis that some of us used to argue in favor of continuing the process. But, I keep thinking about the situation today, and has any leadership in the world thought through how one deals with ethnicity in a national state system? What kinds of steps have to be taken both to protect minorities but also to meet their legitimate demands for protection of cultural roots, in some cases language, in a world that is more and more integrated both politically and economically? Does it mean anything to continue a kind of national state system in a world that, our markets blow up one day, the next day they close the market in Moscow? These borders, so-called, only mean something at the grassroots level where people begin to feel threatened by a national culture that does not give them the opportunity. And you go back to Gamsa in Georgia and what he did to some of the minorities in the then Georgia. And you've got to remember that these things have roots, and they go back well before him, I'm sure, to see how it is that these, what we would consider to be cultural problems of ethnicity, of feeling of togetherness with your own ethnic group, how that squares with a modern world that is more and more integrated with communications free, people able to travel. Does it make a lot of sense? And in what I would consider to be perhaps older democratic systems, France, Spain, look at what's happened, in Catalonia and in the Basque area, in both France and Spain. Clearly their governments have not done enough, although the Spanish had gone to great lengths to give autonomy to the various cultures within Spain. And still there's a hold on people that the extremists can capitalize on that makes, the idea of a process being able to deal with it, to me, almost ludicrous, because these feelings are so deeply felt and are embedded in the sort of history of what people consider themselves to be.
I'd also like to add that everybody keeps on talking about the Eastern leaders, and I will point out that each one of those Eastern leaders had their own reasons for signing up to CSCE, and those weren't usually the same reasons. I'm more familiar with the Romanian case, but for example, Romania was a big proponent of CSCE primarily because it codified into international law, if you want, the equality of states, which they then turned around and used that against the Soviets and their relations with the Soviets. It wasn't so much for them a question of their relationship with the West, it was a question of their relationship with the Soviets. East Germans had their own reasons for signing up to it. The Poles had their own reasons. The Hungarians had their own reasons. And maybe, Oliver, you can maybe touch a little bit more on some of the differences between the Eastern Europeans towards the CSCE process. I'll take one more question, and then we'll have a reception, and you can ask as many questions as possible. Let's take the two questions first, Stephen, and then...
My name is Stephen Shore. I always thought that the fall of the GDR might be considered a failure of intelligence, paradoxically, on the part of the Stasi, that they seemed to be out of touch that Moscow was going to advocate the what was called the Sinatra Doctrine, and once the ultimate backstop of the prospect of Soviet intervention was removed, it became clear that the states could not survive on their own without this backstop, and also, well, for our viewpoint, at least as Americans, that we would prefer the political freedom of the Yeltsin era in Russia to what we have today. I don't recall Yeltsin or Gorbachev ever advocating political liberties as a positive good. It was more a concession to economic and political weakness than an attempt to rally ongoing public support for a free civil society. And not surprisingly, it became viewed, I think, by a majority of Russians, these brief periods, as the modern equivalent of the 17th century time of troubles. So it was more a period of viewed as weakness rather than as a future strength.
Right over
there. Dave Rogers, independent scholar, particularly Ambassador Hartman. Henry Kissinger was a cynical Cold Warrior without a scrap of principle. So I'm wondering why he bought into something as lofty as the Helsinki Agreement, other than the fact that it might get him a lot of favorable press coverage.
I think ultimately, I can't speak for him, but what I found in our arguments was the idea that you had to keep the West together, that had to be the basis of any U.S. policy in terms of facing the challenge of a Soviet Union at that time, which was still threatening. And so I think he was convinced by Schmidt and others that you had absolutely to meet this problem head on. And then we came along and gave him a rationale for doing this by telling him in a cynical way that this was probably the most subversive thing he could do if he wanted to bring that society down. And I used it cynically, I must say. I had my fingers crossed that it would ever come about. In fact, I retired in '87, and I never thought I'd see the wall come down. So that stands by my sort of predictive capacity.
Right. Let me pick up the argument by Bill Hill on that the CSCE process was everything but a straight line. It might look like it if you look at the chronology. You have Helsinki, then you have Belgrade, 77, 78, then you have Madrid, you have Vienna, you have the parallel conferences in Stockholm or Geneva, and it all looks, from a purely diplomatic CSCE point of view, it looks like there has been ongoing continuity. If you actually look at the discussions, even within these follow-up meetings, you're absolutely right. This is not a straight line. But I wonder if that meandering of the CSCE process, to put it politely, was not predictable. At least some people predicted it. Egon Bahr has been mentioned. And in fact, when he draws up his blueprint for Ostpolitik, and the blueprint for Ostpolitik is basically to end with a multilateralization of that kind of bridge-building idea. Now, why do you need multilateralization, you think? when the Germans made all these nice bilateral treaties. We have the Warsaw Treaty, we have the Moscow Treaty, we have the basic treaty with the GDR, follows treaties with Prague, Hungary, Sofia, etc., etc. Well, you need multilateralization to make that process irreversible. Now, why do you need to make it irreversible? Because at some point, Barr argues, as late back as 66 or 67, the Russians and the communist leaders will actually notice what they have let themselves into. And it is at that point that you have to create a network of incentives to make that process continue, even if it is dented, to keep on talking with each other. And you can only do that if the whole thing is not a zero-sum game. There have to be gains for each side. And maybe that leads us back to the question from our Georgian colleague. In my feeling on Western attitudes towards Russia, there has been too much static thinking over the past couple of years. We need another game idea that delivers advantages for all sides on the security aspects, on the ethnicity aspects, which are, of course, closely connected to the first aspect, but also on economics, on sustainable diplomacy, on cultural relations, etc., etc. And the worst thing you can do at this moment is to think up gains and losses, checks and balances as a zero-sum game. We gain, they lose. That doesn't work. Then you can't have a process.
Well, on that note, I want to thank all of you for coming today. Fascinating discussion and proof once again that history remains pertinent to for today. I want to point out that we do have copies of the e-dossier outside for you guys to pick up if you so desire. It's also available up on the website, cwihp.org. You also have over there links to the actual documents that Dr. Bange and Stefan Kinigan used to write the e-dossier. And we have a small reception, some refreshments outside, so please stick around. The book is out for sale, and ask additional questions. Thank you.